Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. There are lawyers who spend their lives inside legal codes, and then there are those who, at some point, begin to ask what remains outside the verdicts. Paolo Franceschetti began his career as a legal scholar, a lawyer, a lecturer, and author of technical texts on law, a linear path, institutional, rational, until the law, on its own, was no longer enough. Over the years, Franceschetti turned his attention to some of the most controversial and unresolved criminal cases in modern Italian history. Not as a simple observer, but as an analyst of judicial language, omissions, and blind spots. The case of the Monster of Florence became a turning point, an endless investigation, countless theories, truths that changed shape depending on who was telling the story. That is where an uncomfortable question emerged. What if some crimes were not only acts of violence, but messages? From that moment on, his research took a radical direction. Franceschetti began to explore the symbolic dimension of crime, advancing the idea that certain murders may follow ritual patterns, recurring structures, a grammar that lies outside traditional criminology. This work led to books and essays connecting law, symbolism, Freemasonry, power, and religion, including the controversial trilogy The Masonic System and the Order of the Rosa Croce. These are not texts that claim definitive answers, but ones that seek to shift the perspective. Franceschetti does not speak of conspiracies in their most superficial sense. He speaks of structures, of initiatory traditions, of archetypes that persist through history, and of how, at times, violence seems to follow a form, not just a motive. He has worked as a defense lawyer in complex criminal trials, including the case of the Beasts of Satan, always guided by the same conviction: that there is a disturbing gap between judicial truth and actual truth. Paolo Franceschetti operates there, inside that gap. In that space where crime ceases to be mere news and becomes the night side of our society. This is the first chapter of a longer investigation. Over the next few weeks, the Night Side will explore one of the darkest and most controversial cases in Italian criminal history, the Monster of Florence. But this episode is not about hypotheses or suspects. Not yet. This video serves as an introduction, a step back, before going deeper. Because to understand the Monster of Florence, one must first understand a broader and far more unsettling idea: the concept of ritual murder. In this episode, we will summarize and analyze the content of a talk by Paolo Franceschetti, originally published on Border Nights, a historic Italian alternative media channel, and a space where Franceschetti has long been a familiar voice. Rather than focusing on forensic details or judicial timelines, this material addresses a different level of interpretation: the symbolic structure of certain crimes, the repetition of patterns, and the possibility that some murders are not only acts of violence, but intentional rituals. This first video lays the groundwork. It introduces the language, the framework, and the questions that will guide the investigation. In the episodes to come, we will move closer to the Monster of Florence itself. We will examine the case in detail. We will confront inconsistencies, symbols, and unresolved threads. And among them, we will uncover a strange and unexpected connection: a possible link between the Italian case and a notorious American serial killer known as Zodiac. This is where we begin. Over the years, analyzing the most notorious and high-profile murders in Italy, Franceschetti noticed a recurring and unsettling detail: blood. not blood as a mere physical trace, but as an element that, in ritualistic killings, reveals the very structure of the crime scene and investigative anomalies. Often, in fact, victims are not killed at the location where their bodies are later found. The murder occurs elsewhere and is then staged afterward. This creates a glaring inconsistency: the blood. In some of the most famous cases, such as Cogne or Erba, as well as the victims of the Monster of Florence, corpses were discovered in environments where the blood traces did not match the reported sequence of events, or even the weapon used. The absence or incoherent distribution of blood signals that something in the official reconstruction does not add up. Franceschetti recalls that, initially, even those working daily in law enforcement or forensic labs could doubt these observations. A friend from the Florence Mobile Squad, for example, at first considered him paranoid. Over time, however, she too began noticing similar patterns: murders with impossible modalities, wounds that did not correspond to the narrative, and the constant sense that reality had been manipulated. These are not mere assumptions. Knives, body positions, and the amount and distribution of blood suggest a carefully staged scene. This staging is no accident. In ritualistic murders, perpetrators often follow precise, symbolic, or esoteric schemes that go beyond conventional criminology. Franceschetti emphasizes that in Italian cases, from the Monster of Florence murders to the events in Cogne and Erba, recurring elements emerge: extremely violent methods of killing, ritualistic details such as incisions, body arrangements, objects placed near the victim, and a meticulous care in leaving or removing traces. All of this is filtered through a media context that often distorts, trivializes, or mystifies reality, making it difficult for an external observer to distinguish fact from interpretation. Franceschetti cites specific cases: the Cogne murder, where the initial official reconstruction clashed with physical evidence; the Erba case, in which media interpretation contributed to a narrative of immediate guilt without considering investigative inconsistencies; and, of course, the Monster of Florence, a saga spanning decades, with seemingly ritualistic killings connected through patterns that only in-depth analysis can begin to reveal. What emerges from these investigations is that victims are often chosen according to particular criteria, and the murders are designed not merely to kill, but to send a message, to act on precise symbols. Franceschetti insists that, beyond sensationalist theories, there is tangible evidence of rituality. The sequence of killings, the types of wounds inflicted, the choice of locations, and the use or removal of blood. All these elements, taken together, suggest that behind certain murders lies a more complex plan, often elusive to immediate comprehension. Another significant episode involves Nicola Sapone from the Besti di Satana case. Nicola was convinced he had committed horrific acts as described by witnesses, striking his friend with a hammer, dancing on the corpse, committing cruel acts. Yet, when confronted with reality, his clothes were clean and his hands intact. Nicola, drugged and confused, believed himself guilty because he was made to believe so, but he had not actually carried out those acts. This dynamic is frequently found in ritualistic murders. People are led to believe they committed deeds they never did, due to psychological manipulation or external conditioning. Another important observation concerns the role of magistrates and investigators. In high-profile cases, investigations are often fragmented. Police, forensic experts, magistrates, and journalists operate on different levels, with only partial knowledge. Franceschetti points out how this fragmentation fosters errors, superficiality, and, in some cases, outright misdirection. Evidence is interpreted according to the prevailing narrative, Anomalies are ignored or explained with unconvincing theories, and the truth slips away. The Monster of Florence, in particular, becomes emblematic of all this. From 1968 through the 1980s and 1990s, the murders exhibited a constant pattern. Young couples killed during outdoor sexual encounters, multiple stab wounds, often with similar knives, and obsessive attention to crime scene details. Franceschetti observes that, despite decades of investigations and trials, many anomalies were never explained. The sequence of murders, the choice of locations, and above all, the inconsistencies in blood and forensic evidence. Even when suspects were identified or accused, a gray area remained that prevented full closure of the case. Similarly, other cases like Cogne and Erba reveal a comparable phenomenon, though less evident. Media-covered murders that become ritualized in the narrative more than in reality, with details that, when carefully read, reveal discrepancies between what is reported and what actually happened. Franceschetti emphasizes that understanding these patterns does not necessarily explain the motive or identify the killer, but allows one to grasp the logical and symbolic structure of the crimes, highlighting repeated patterns, the importance of locations, and the role of blood as an indicator of manipulation or ritual. The common thread through all these cases is clear. In ritualistic murders, every detail matters, and nothing is accidental. The distribution of blood, the position of bodies, objects present, and the chosen locations are all indicators of a larger design, often incomprehensible at first glance. Franceschetti underscores that the work of an investigator or scholar must go beyond media narratives, confronting material evidence, crime patterns, and event chronology to reconstruct, at least partially, the internal logic of these murders. At the end of the episode, Franceschetti recalls the concluding reflection. Regardless of the complexity of these phenomena, the magic, the psychological conditioning, or manipulations, what truly matters is focusing on one's own life, awareness, and the present moment. Everything else, the ritualistic murders, the dark events, remains in the background, a context to be observed and understood, but not allowed to dominate one's existence. In the next episode, we will step inside the Monster of Florence case, walking through the crime scenes, unraveling the victims' stories, and tracing the patterns that have haunted Italy for decades. Every detail matters. Every clue chills. The truth is closer than you think, if you dare to look.